you so much, Meredith, for that introduction. I was telling her earlier that every time she introduces one of us, we leave feeling like really like motivated and like, is she talking about me? Is this my work? Am I that amazing? So I appreciate that. I also want to say thank you to everyone at the Radcliffe Institute. You all take such good care of us and make us feel so special. Everyone from Jess, who always gives me a warm smile when I walk in the building, to the folks who have helped me when I've locked myself out of the office at night. So I'm thankful to you all. And also I want to say thank you to my fellow fellows, many of whom have heard me speak about my research. And so it's a pleasure to present it in more fullness and richness, I hope, today. But also to friends and colleagues who are on various fellowships across campus that I've been able to connect with since I've been here. Thank you to you all, especially my folks from the Hutchins Center who came over to see me. I'm glad that you're here. So let me just say that this is my first time presenting any of this research. So I want to allow myself to be loose with it and have some fun because, as Meredith said, like I'm a serious scholar, but I also like to bring some humor and hilarity to my work because I think it keeps me grounded and it keeps me, human and realizing that I'm not just a thinker, I'm also a three-dimensional being. So I want to bring some of that energy to the podium tonight as I present on this work, The Glamorous Life, Socialite-Activists and the Black freedom struggle from World War II to the age of Obama. First, I'd like to say I'm sorry to anyone who wanted to hear me talk about Barack Obama in depth. I won't be doing that tonight. I'm kind of starting from the front end of the project, so most of it will be about this immediate post-World War II era. But I'm more than happy to let you know what I'm thinking about Barack Obama, in particular one of his, the early members of his administration, who I might speak about in a little bit of detail if there's enough time towards the end of my talk. But I'm happy to talk about Barack Obama during the Q&A. So the first kernels of this project actually date back to graduate school when I was working on my first book, Liberated Threads, and I'll give you a sense of how I arrived at this topic a little bit later on, but my interest in it never died. You know, when you're a graduate researcher and you say, oh, this is gonna be my second book because you find a few interesting documents in the archive, but who really, does it really become the second book? So I guess technically this won't be my second book, but it is one of my, the project that I imagined then. It still is, it's very similar to what I imagined then in terms of its shape and scope. And I used the Schomburg Center Fellowship to collect much of the archival material that I'll present on today, but it wasn't until this last semester at the Radcliffe that I was able to actually start analyzing some of that data. So what I'm going to be presenting tonight are some of my first impressions about a lot of the research I found in the archive while I was at the Schomburg Center. Tea and shade, an introduction. And for me, it's a way of thinking about the embodiment of the women in this era that they were living through. Tea and shade. How many people are familiar with this language, tea and shade? All right, I know you're like, oh, wait, I knew that. As soon as I said it, you're like, I already know what tea and shade means. You don't have to tell me. But I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how tea and shade informs how I'm thinking about these socialite activist women. So in spring 1954, the New York Amsterdam News published a series of stories on Black society women. Betty Granger, the series author and Amsterdam News social editor, argued that society life had changed quite drastically since the days when A'Lelia Walker reigned as the queen of Black social life in New York City. The millionaire heiress to the Madam C.J. Walker beauty empire hosted lavish events both at her Manhattan apartment and also at her Westchester County estate, Villa Luaro. By the time of Granger's series, the original Black 400 had all but died off, and many of their customs, rituals, and standards had perished with them. Who was the current grande dame of Black society? Granger wanted to know. What were the new requirements for becoming a social leader? Granger wrote, "We want our readers to decide in true democratic fashion exactly who rules supreme as New York's modern-day social queen." For 3 weeks, the Amsterdam News accepted letters and postcards from readers who casted their votes. And the letters poured in, even from people who didn't live in New York, but who wanted to offer commentary on the so-called Black elite. Commenting on the old guard rules for becoming part of the Negro aristocracy, Granger reminded readers that it's long been said that to join the ranks of Black society, you must, quote, take a woman with some family background, add a bit of basic education, toss in some accessible cash, and mix plentifully with membership in one or two nationally established clubs or sororities. And there you have the fundamental requirements for our social potpourri, unquote. Yet she notes that there were regional or even state-to-state differences. She claims that in the Midwest, notably Chicago and Detroit, it's money and more money that makes an ambitious gal eligible for high society. In Atlanta, she says, it's education. A PhD is your best bet for social success. In Charleston, South Carolina, your rank in the social order is gauged by, quote, the paleness of your skin. And in Boston, she says, it's family background and nothing else that lets you in. So she notes here that whereas people had just accepted these rules pretty much as gospel, that in the post-World War II era, that people were challenging these ideas and that there was opportunity for people who never would have been considered part of Black society to now enter that said society. So people were critiquing colorism, the possessing a distinguished family name, and the requirement of generational wealth. Well, essentially the whole entire system. Everything she said that people wanted you to have to be a part of society, she says now it's pretty much a no-go. People are trying to throw out these old rules. So at the end of the 3-week voting period, Granger noted that they received hundreds of letters from readers near and far. And the Amsterdam News, of course, published the most provocative missives. And again, let me say, people had many feelings on the topic, and they was all up in their feelings. So for example, Ms. Avis Malkoa, an employee of the Edison Hotel, goes in, calling out what she considers the types of socialites: the nasty snobs with too much useless education, the dumb yellow chicks, these are her words, not mine, who use their good looks to make up for their lack of pedigree, and the big shot women who lucked into wealth by hitting the lottery but have none of the social graces. For example, she says, they buy Cadillacs with their winnings, throw wild parties, drink all the brown liquor, and, quote, wind up talking loud and wrong. Malkoa pivots to acknowledge the women she feels are outstanding members of our race, women who have given unselfishly to uplift the race, the entire race, not just a particular class. She names Mary McLeod Bethune, who you're gonna hear about in a little bit, and Marian Anderson as examples. Eva Tucker, a member of the Metropolitan Mothers Club, so she would have been one of these society women, wrote in saying that the modern social leader must be an intelligent career woman who must have distinguished themselves in this community in terms of civic leadership. She must entertain in good taste and smart style. Because according to Tucker, quote, Madam Walker's style of big-time entertaining is no longer fashionable. People woke up to the fact long time ago that spending hundreds and maybe even thousands of dollars on food and drink for would-be friends wasn't the smartest thing in the world to do, end quote. On the top of Eve Tucker's list, a society leader who met all of her requirements was a woman whom most people in this room have never heard of before, Molly Moon. My talk will center on Moon, the undisputed social queen of Harlem in the mid-20th century. In her obituary in 1990, Jet magazine, one of the Black Bibles, wrote that Moon had raised $3.4 million for the National Urban League, and she'd also helped fundraise for other smaller Harlem-based organizations and institutions. Moon is most known for founding the Urban League Guild and serving as president of the Guild for 50 years. It's a long time. That's That should tell you something about her personality. I'm just saying. The Urban League Guild was the social wing of the National Urban League that helped translate the organization's mission to everyday people and wealthy would-be donors. In short, they made the organization look cool and have broader appeal. In hip-hop parlance, the Guild was the hype man to the MC. I first learned of Molly as a graduate student trying to learn all I could about a Black nationalist protest against the white-owned wig shop. And the more I learned about her and the Beaux-Arts costume ball and beauty pageant the Guild hosted each year, the more I became intrigued not only by how she raised all of that money and for which specific causes, but by the culture of fundraising and the lifestyle of a fundraiser, a social and political power broker, and the power broker's role within this larger constellation of activists and intellectuals who feature prominently in civil rights movement history. And I've been following the money trail, and it's led me to some interesting places. Some scandalous places even. I've also discovered the names of other women like Molly who've used their social cachet and extensive networks to host both public and private events for a range of organizations devoted to racial equality. So the scholarship has taught us, and it's a rather robust scholarship, that says that Black women were the backbone of the movement. No matter what period of time we look at, this is true, whether we're talking about the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the Black Lives Matter movement of today, women are the backbone. However, the nature and international scope of their fundraising has gone understudied. So, what I've been trying to do then is piece together this history and understand why these women are not in the historiography. So I think part of the problem is a question about paradigms. So in my first book, Liberated Threads, I tried to introduce a new way or paradigm for studying the civil rights movement, because what I'd realized was that Black women's activism had been kind of categorized into these types. So the respectable church lady and the radical freedom fighter being two of them that have emerged from this time period as lenses for seeing and understanding Black women's cultural and political activism. And also because questions of periodization and subfield-specific questions have meant that Molly Moon and her generation have not been highly visible, because they haven't fit neatly within the Black women's club movement literature, which typically ends at the start of World War II. And temporarily, Molly's generation considered themselves patrons of the arts, that was one of their major commitments in terms of their activism, and they fall into this lacuna between the scholarship on the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s and 30s and the Black arts movement in the 60s and 70s. So for me, I'm interested in what they were doing in the 40s and 50s as it relates to Black arts and the protection and proliferation of Black arts in that time period. Also, I find that we don't see them in the old left to new left conversation, which typically doesn't focus on Black women much at all. But they also haven't been taken up in this Black internationalism scholarship either. And they also aren't part of this Black intellectual history turn, because they sit at this interesting and quite challenging to recover intersection of civil rights history, business history, beauty and grooming culture, fashion, consumer and economics, and also material culture. So there's this small yet burgeoning body of scholarship that does this type of recovery work. So I would say my first two books, I think, do this work and try to establish a way for doing this work, and through what I call eclectic archiving, which, as Meredith mentioned earlier, requires me to draw from a lot of different types of source material and also take an interdisciplinary approach to the study of history. But then there's also Robert Weems' Desegregating the Black Dollar, Susanna Walker's Style and Status, my colleague Tiffany Gill's Beauty Shop Politics, and her new book on Black women in travel. And as we talk more and more about our work, we realize we have so many women in common that overlap in our work. And then also Quincy Mills' cutting along the color line, and his new project, The Wages of Resistance, which also looks at how the civil rights and Black power organizations negotiated their need for funds and fundraising with their anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist ideologies. In my own work, I'm toying with this concept of Black glamour as a guiding framework to uncover the modes of embodied activism that Molly and her peers employed. It began with my fascination with our collective fascination with the Black glamour set. Entire Tumblrs and Instagrams have been devoted to celebrating Black history of glamour as a way to celebrate our humanity, our style, our pleasure and joy, the beauty of our people, to challenge the notion that high femininity and refinement was solely for white women. That Black women have been about that life, which is really true. Look at any time period, Black women have been glamorous. Thus, glamour becomes an interesting way to examine insider-outsider cultures and class categories that become much more malleable when we think of glamour as a performance, one that is often more about aspiration than what one has in the bank account. So by winning the battle on the taste lines, if not the front lines of the movement, Moon and those who followed in her footsteps influenced modern rules of etiquette, style, and party planning that continue to be promulgated by Ladies' Home Journal and W Magazine. So these women, with their impeccable sense of style and good looks and cosmopolitan charm, had the cultural capital necessary to host these star-studded fundraising events and exclusive parties that brought politicians, activists, and prominent philanthropists, such as the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the Fields of the Marshall Fields department store empire, and so forth, into conversation with one another and with the wider movement. So I delve into this opulent world of the Black middle class, or this Black elite, to examine how conspicuous consumption, pleasure, and leisure culture both coalesce with and undermine the aims of the Black Freedom Project. Specifically, I, like Quincy Mills, am thinking critically about how Moon and her ilk are touting relationships with families whose names are synonymous with American capitalism and heads of state in the British Empire in the Caribbean, while activists like Claudia Jones are using every platform possible to dismantle imperialism. But somebody's gotta raise the money. So if we look at all of these organizations, we see some ties that raise eyebrows. Enter the tea and the shade. Okay, so these women were hyper visible in the archive. And in my own archive, I now have over 2,000 clippings from Black newspapers on Moon and Eunice Johnson, who features prominently in the work, and also Desiree Rogers, who was the first social secretary of the Obama administration. And when I'm reading these newspaper clippings and putting them in conversation with all sorts of other material, including literature and menus from the venues they hosted their events, from personal correspondence, I see that the tea was spilling and the shade was intense, especially from the Baltimore Afro-American. That was a shady newspaper. I love them. I love reading their account of this Black high society and the fact that they feel like from their vantage point in Baltimore, they have the ability to speak on what's happening in New York's the big town Black society in ways that the New York Amsterdam News can't, because they are essentially a vehicle of the National Urban League. So I want to just talk a little bit about Molly, a woman that I have really come to admire a lot. I love her. I love writing about complicated Black women, and she is complicated and complex and messy in all the ways that makes my job as a historian and a storyteller fun. So I love her. So to put it bluntly, Molly was a hustler, okay? Molly came from a family of no importance that wasn't at all wealthy, and that had migrated from the South to the Midwest. And in the Midwest, I'm talking about Gary, Indiana. And I can say it like that because I'm from Indiana. But so by the time I encounter Molly in the archive, she is moving back and forth between New York and Gary. She was born, allegedly, in 1912. I don't know. I just feel like these women, are you really telling the truth about your age? I don't really know. So many of her background details are sketchy because she, like a lot of women in this interwar period who were moving across the US, were using this as an opportunity to remake themselves. So Molly attended Meharry Medical College, and she earns a degree in pharmacy. She takes a few classes at Columbia's Teacher College, and she eventually becomes a social worker, of all things. And she meets Henry Lee Moon, who will become her husband, on a trip to Russia in the early 1930s. So she did her bit to study abroad, and she tried to learn, she was learning German too. And Henry is also from the Midwest, and he's from Cleveland, but from a more prominent family. His father actually founded the chapter of the NAACP in Cleveland. Henry has a degree from Howard. He pledged Omega Psi Phi, so he has the fraternity credentials there. He earned a master's degree, and he's a journalist writing for the Amsterdam News when they meet. He goes on to become a public relations director for the NAACP and also a writer for The Crisis. So, but while Molly's moving back and forth between her mother's home in Gary and New York City, where she's meeting all these folks, she finds that she has a knack for meeting wealthy people, prominent writers. For example, I was digging around in the Schlesinger archive, and I found this letter from Molly to writer Dorothy West. And in it, Dorothy, for people who don't know, Dorothy is the daughter of one of the wealthiest Black families in Boston. And Molly is saying to her, "I'm flat broke. We should move in together. Like, you can help me pay my bills and we can split our rent." I think she says here it'd be $14 for each of us, right, if we move in together. So she has this knack for meeting people, for making friends. She's good at corresponding and keeping in touch with people. And so by the time she marries Henry Lee Moon in 1938, she is known for being this active woman on the social scene in New York City. And let me just say this as an aside, it just made me love her more. But when they start corresponding, I've been all up in their letters. They write the way we text. I mean, there's just so many letters. And he was pretty much engaged to this other woman. And so Molly's writing him, "Oh, hey, you know, all this stuff. They're friends." And then before you know it, she has him paying her mother's medical bills. I'm like, yes, Molly. So anyway, so she ends up moving to New York City, and they get married, they get a place together, and they become known as the socialite and the intellectual. They both see themselves as race people. She's a race woman, so she's not just a party planner. She is also a woman who cares very much about the equality of Black people and ending racial disparities. And so she first tries to mold herself after some of these women of the Black 400, as they were known. These women who, are you familiar with this language of the 400? Like in the late 19th century was this idea that, we're gonna throw this party and we're gonna invite, it can fit 400 people, so we're only gonna invite the most important 400 society people. So then of course, Black people had their version of this, the Black 400. So Molly is trying to model herself after Bessie Bearden, who is Romare Bearden's mom and a very active on the social and art scenes in Harlem. But by the time she establishes the Guild in 1942, she realizes that this is her place, that this is the way that she can make her mark. And so in 1947, the Los Angeles Sentinel writes, "Undisputed Harlem hostess, beyond comparison this season, is individual, dynamic Molly Moon. Her parties gather the most fascinating people in town. They're like the Negro Renaissance era in flavor and texture. Nobody in town can come near her for sheer excellence and unusual party giving. She reigns supreme and legendary." So these are some images from an Urban League luncheon that Molly is hosting. Molly is standing with the white blazer on. So then a pivotal moment happens in her career as this socialite who's trying to really emerge as a race woman as well. In May 1951, Molly called the Hotel Pierre to book the rooftop garden and secure catering for a party to be held on the evening of July 20th. Now, the key to being a successful socialite and hostess is as you can imagine, I'm sure, location, 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 right? You have to have the dopest spots to have your events, period. People want to go somewhere that they can feel like, ooh, yes, like this is the place to be. So she's hosting the Urban League's wealthiest donors at this event. And so she decides that the Pierre, with its Upper East Side address, it sits at 2 East 61st and 5th Avenue, had that air of refinement and exclusivity that Molly needed for the event. Plus, it was a visually stunning hotel, from its decor to its unobstructed views of Central Park. And so she calls over the phone to make, to book the garden, on the roof for her event. And she's told, sure, yes, you can book the event there, we can get the catering set up, etc. So then Molly strolls in to the Pierre to pay her deposit. This is how I imagine she walked in there. I don't know. And then I imagine her sounding like Eartha Kitt and saying like, yes, darling, I'm here to pay my deposit, right? So she goes to pay this deposit, and the assistant to the catering manager is like, oh no, that room is closed. It's booked that day. It's booked that day. I think they told her it was booked that day, and they told her it was closed. They told her both. It's closed for repairs, and it's already booked. And so she was saying, well, hey, I was told over the phone that I could make this booking, and he's like, no, you can't. The man she spoke to on the phone, a guy named W.M. Willie, refused to speak to her in person. And a couple of days later, Molly had one of her friends go in there then, since they refused to give her the booking, the wife of a prominent Wall Street attorney named Elizabeth Philman, and she had her attempt to book the rooftop for that same day. So Willie, the banquet manager, asked Philman if any colored persons would be attending the event she was planning. He reminded her that the Pierre was a high-class hotel. Once she assured him that no Negroes would be present, he accepted her booking. Well, that was all the proof Molly needed. She filed a lawsuit against Getty Realty Corporation, the company that owned the hotel, the banquet manager, and his assistant under the, sections 40 and 41 of the New York State Civil Rights Law concerning public accommodations. And then Philman and another person whom Molly had booked the rooftop for that day, for the day before, actually, since she was told that it was, well, one of the excuses they gave her that it was closed for repair, she had both of them testify for her in court. And the judge presiding over the case was a man named Abraham Goodman, who presided over one of the first cases tried in New York following the enactment of the Civil Rights Law. So Molly won her case and received a $600 settlement. So the max she could receive was $500 per defendant. And so she wins this $600, and people see this as a victory. And the Baltimore Afro-American writes, the Urban League Guild was, quote, more militant than the parent group which organized it. Shade, right? I just love it, right? So they're saying basically that Molly was bold enough to do something that even the Urban League Guild doesn't use as a tactic. She was using the court systems in her favor. And once she did this, her popularity really skyrocketed. Just as a note of aside here in terms of methods, once I found this lawsuit, I started to look to see if there were other similar lawsuits. Are these socialite women, who want to host garden rooftop parties saying, well, listen, if you won't give us bookings, we will sue you. So I'm looking for that. But I'm also keeping a list of hotels that are mentioned in the Black press as places that allowed them to host these events. And so here's a list of the names that I've come across so far. Now, I will admit most of my research has been going through documents based on Molly in New York City, so I imagine that as I dig into the research in DC and Chicago, more hotels will be added to this list. So like I said, after this event, after the lawsuit, Molly's popularity soars, and she's honored as Woman of the Year for her 14 years of aspiring and distinguished leadership with the Urban League Guild, the Harlem Hospital Auxiliary, and the Spence Chapin Adoption Service. And it's noted in the publication, this is not about that. I just like this because she's wearing a fur and a big hat, and I love a big hat. So, but this image, it just kind of speaks to the identity that she's trying to create at the time. But when she receives this award, Ralph J. Bunche presents her with the award. And so the black press is like, Molly's famous. Ralph Bunche is presenting her with the award. And then the legendary journalist and society woman, Jerry Major, who was part of the Black 400, toasted Molly, as well as her very good friend, Jean Murray Vanderbilt, the wife of Alfred Vanderbilt II. So she has these famous and important friends who see her as an important woman. And also in 1959, she was honored alongside Lorraine Hansberry for her commitment to civic welfare. So they're feting Lorraine Hansberry, and Molly is right there with Lorraine Hansberry. I'm saying this just to give you a sense of the scope of her popularity and the reach. But she was also this very polarizing figure, right? So on the one hand, she has the engine of the black press who's promoting everything she's doing. On the other hand, except for the Baltimore African American, they're not having anything to, they will critique her when they feel like it's necessary. But she's also the subject of much scrutiny and criticism. She's accused of misappropriating funds, and that was actually a very interesting article to read where basically the New York Amsterdam News reports that the Urban League is like, okay, hands off, we're gonna let them figure it out because a white woman was claiming that Molly misappropriated funds for events. So they kind of took a hands-off approach and let Molly handle it. There was also lots of gossip about her alleged affairs. And in the mid-1960s, she sued a very prominent and wealthy white socialite for $1 million for defamation. There was scrutiny about her interracial approach to race relations, and one of the most fascinating things I found on this was a book by Chester Himes, a social and political satire called Pink Toes. It was published in 1961, where Moon is the inspiration for the maligned protagonist, Mamie Mason. And so Himes is critical of Mamie Mason and these interracial parties that she throws, which he considers orgies. For the racial uplift cause. And what's interesting is that Himes is first cousins to Molly's husband, Henry. And so he was actually living with Molly and Henry at the time that he's doing all this research for the book. And then he writes this scathing piece on interracial race relations and their parties for the book. Gotta love family. It's an interesting book. You should check it out. So in my last few minutes, I wanna say a little bit specifically about fundraising here. So as I mentioned earlier, one of Molly's most popular events was the Beaux-Arts Ball, which she started hosting in 1942. And these balls were the major fundraisers for the Urban League Guild. As you can see here, well, first let me point out, this is Molly here. Isn't that a hat? That's a hat, isn't it? Ooh. So this is the Beaux-Arts Queen for that year. Do you know who this is? Right, so we got Josephine Baker here. I mean, when Molly can make Josephine Baker look like just a regular person, when she's like, woo. Okay, so I love this picture. This is from another ball. And remember, there were costume balls, so each year had a theme. It doesn't look like she's like, I hear you, bruh, but nah. Like, her body language here is so interesting. But this is another one of the balls. And then here's Molly with Gordon Parks and Gloria Vanderbilt at another one of the balls. So these are the major fundraisers. They were public, and it was the social event of the year for Blacks in Harlem, but also people traveling from out of town to attend this event. And by 1955, the year after Betty Granger's Amsterdam News series on social leaders, Molly's Beaux-Arts Ball had raised nearly $420,000 in today's figures for the Urban League. And it was one of the most popular events on the New York social calendar, which, as I mentioned, brought together celebrities, everyday folks, philanthropists, and so forth. And it was fueled by this Miss Beaux-Arts pageant, which is how I stumbled across Molly to begin with, because one of her pageant queens was the face of this white-owned wig shop that my black nationalist folks, Kwame Brathwaite, were protesting against. So I was like, this woman's a Beaux-Arts queen. What's a Beaux-Arts queen? So that's how I found Molly, through the pageant, which was sponsored by the Schaefer Brewing Company. And they put forth all this money to fund the beauty pageant. And each year, people would vote on a slate of beauty queen contestants. And they've noted in the Amsterdam News that they would have upwards of 1 million people voting for the Beaux-Arts queen. So this just gives you a sense of the scope. But I don't want to go on too much about these balls because at the end of the day, you know, a gala is a gala. A lot of us have been to those events before. What I have found fascinating is the emphasis on these fashion shows. Fashion shows as fundraisers. So they were common in the early 20th century amongst the original Black 400, and people like Bernie Austin and Bessie Bearden and Lilia Walker would host these events, these fundraiser events that featured the fashions of a lot of Black women designers. But with the Great Depression and then also the rations on textiles during World War II, they kind of fell out of vogue. But when I look through some of the clippings in terms of where Molly was going or what the Urban League Guild was up to, they decided to host their Urban League Guild executive meeting in Chicago to coincide with the Urban AIDS, which was like the local Chicago version of the Urban League Guild, their annual fashion show, to see if that model, which had been successful in Chicago, could be a fundraising model they could implement it in other guilds across the country. So it looks to me that Molly does decide that fashion shows would be good fundraisers for the guild. And by 1959, not only are the fashion shows regular fundraisers, Molly partners with Eunice Johnson, who is the founder of the Ebony Fashion Fair and wife of John Johnson, who of course owns Johnson Publications, so Ebony, Jet, Negro Digest, to bring the Ebony Fashion Fair to the Waldorf Astoria in New York in 1959. And I don't know about you all, but we had Ebony Fashion Fair in my hometown when I grew up. It was like a big thing, but I never realized what the fashion fair was other than a fashion fair, right? But that a local organization would host the fair and they would use the monies raised to support whatever cause was, the cause of that year for the organization. So by the time Molly had brought the fashion fair to New York City, the fair had traveled to 51 cities and 31 states. Enter Mary McLeod Bethune, who I mentioned earlier, who at this point in the late 1940s is still the president of the National Association of Negro Women, and she sponsors the creation of the National Association of Fashion and Accessories Designers. We'll just call it NAFAD. So I say late 40s because this is when NAFAD is founded. So by the time we get to the late 1950s, when these fashion shows are very common, we have an organization for Black women fashion and accessories designers. Now think about this. In this era of Jim Crow, the fashion industry was segregated. So these Black women who were trying to move from being deemed as seamstresses to being designers are now trying to get work in the haute couture industry, but they can't find jobs. So NAFAD becomes a vehicle through which they can work on professionalization, where they can develop their craft, they can establish and extend their professional networks, and it becomes a place where they can brand themselves as designers. And so NAFAD helped launch the careers of people like Lois Alexander, who now a lot of people know because she designed Jackie Kennedy's wedding gown, and Zelda Wynne Valdez. I'm writing a piece for Valdez for the New York Times that will hopefully be published in a few days. But they are using these fashion show fundraisers as a way to launch their career. So very much we see like this emphasis on equality in all types of Black employment or employment industries, and the rise in fashion shows as fundraisers as interlocked. And I think it's really important to think about Mary McLeod Bethune in this moment, because I think that the way we've constructed her, as a woman who's interested in the equality of women and women's rights and also Black education, we wouldn't associate her with something like fashion, which people think is frivolous. But what she says, that this is another industry where Black women need work. Right? This is another industry where we're trying to cast off this idea of Black women as servants, or in the servile industries that the language like seamstress had historically evoked for Black women. So I'm still trying to weave together this fashion show piece, but I think it's going to be really critical to the book, like this fashion as fundraiser piece. So I have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to conclude here. So my research assistant found this article in the New York Amsterdam News, and when I saw it, I cracked up because does anybody know what chitterlings are, or chitlins as we call them? Right? So sell chitlin dinners to decorate lobby. And Molly's name is mentioned in this story. And I'm like, whoa, okay. Everything that they've tried to do to create this image of glamour, chitlins ain't that, right? You know, it's like these pig intestine scraps that black folks have turned into, you know, a fine cuisine in our community. Listen, for people who still eat pork, when the chitlins hit the table during Thanksgiving, this is like a big deal. Like, my mom thinks she can make chitlins. I don't eat pork no more, so I don't even have to contend with that. I don't have to tell her if she can or can't. I don't think she probably can, though. But so to me, when I think about this idea of selling chitlin dinners, like this type of fundraising that we associate with the Black church, you know, when you have the building fund, it takes you 10 years and you still haven't built one new part of the building, right? But it's funded off of these chicken dinners and chitlin dinners and so on and so forth. So the fact that they were using this language to talk about society women, I found interesting. Now, if you look at the year here, this is 1973. And so for me, I'm intrigued not just by the chitlins piece, but by the year, because by 73, when we're in the, you know, this kind of height of the Black power and soul era, you have these socialite women who are reclaiming these quaint Southern culinary traditions. And I thought this was really interesting, especially after reading all this stuff and learning information about all the top Black women caterers who would cater these private events. I've learned so much about vintage champagne because that was the thing to have. Everybody had vintage champagne. Gordon Parks threw a party at his summer house where he had 12 cases of vintage champagne and 100 pounds of chicken and barbecued chicken and so on and so forth. So to see this piece that's dealing with, that's talking about selling chitlin dinners to decorate a lobby. It's one of these couturiers who probably came up the ranks through the fashion shows that Molly hosted, who's trying to redecorate the lobby of her high-rise apartments in Harlem. And so they're selling chitlin dinners as a way to do this. And so I'm intrigued by this because I want to know, is there another shift that happens in Black society life in the 1970s? Like, where does this story go? Because I feel like I'm starting to get a handle on Molly's generation, how they're defining glamour and high society and Black life and who gets to be in and who isn't in. But what happens when we get to that Black Power movement era where there starts to be more pushback against interracial activism, when the critiques against capitalism and imperialism reach this fever pitch? I want to know what happens to Molly and people of her ilk. We know Molly still continues to be the president of the Urban League Guild because she reigns for 50 years. That is a long time. I'm sorry. Every time I hear that figure. But I'm interested to see what changes because I guess I do have 2 minutes. I can say this. So the bookend for me in terms of how I'm thinking about it now. Who knows what will happen when it actually becomes a book project? But Desiree Rogers for me is an important figure that links the Molly Moon era with this more present and contemporary moment. She's the first social secretary of the Obama administration, and she's from New Orleans. She's a self-proclaimed descendant of New Orleans voodoo queen and socialite Marie Laveau, but doesn't everybody say they're a descendant of Marie Laveau? Everybody says that, right? So, but she's claiming a certain multi-generational tie to hostessing and being able to work closely with the most powerful people in the society. And so she's saying, I come from a particular tradition of fundraising. And so before she becomes social secretary, she gets the gig because of her uncanny ability to raise money for Obama's 2008 campaign. So this Harvard MBA hosted events for Chicago's white and black business elite in her home and used her training in marketing to quote unquote brand Obama for the social media generation. But her visibility also made her a target. I don't know if you all remember that two reality TV stars crashed the White House state dinner, and Desiree Rogers is forced to fall on her sword and resign. But part of the reason why I think that she's forced to resign is because she's so visible. Here's an article of her on the cover of Wall Street Journal. Before we were thinking about Michelle Obama as this fashionista and beauty image, it was Desiree Rogers who was branding herself like this. In true Black society woman form, she was using the media as a way to not only brand Obama, but brand herself. And social secretaries had never before done that. How many social secretaries can you name? But you could name her. And she goes on after she's dismissed to become the CEO of Johnson Publications. So I think that is very interesting because we've seen how Molly partnered with Johnson Publications and the Ebony Fashion Fair in the mid-20th century. So this just shows how small this Black elite community is. So I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this kind of meaty middle tissue in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s that gives us someone like a Desiree Rogers and someone who still sees herself as very much wedded to these traditions of socialite activism and fundraising of her foremothers. Thank you.